From Washington, D.C., this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Hena Zuberi. Our top story tonight. UK Foreign Secretary Lord David Cameron has expressed concern over the possibility that Israel may have violated international law in its war on Gaza. During his appearance before the Foreign Affairs Committee, Cameron acknowledged his worries about Israel's actions. But he stated that government lawyers had not explicitly advised him on this matter. The question of legal advice is crucial in a High Court challenge against the UK government regarding arms export to Israel during the ongoing war. Legal and human rights organizations argue that mounting evidence of Israeli violations of international law in Gaza justifies suspending UK arms exports. Cameron said the country's arms exports to Israel are continually reviewed. He also claimed that decisions are made based on assessments of Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law.
I mean, if you're asking me, am I worried that Israel has taken action that might be in breach of international law because this particular premises has been bombed or whatever? Yes, of course I'm worried about that, and that's why I consult the Foreign Office lawyers when giving this advice on arms exports. So that's why I don't. If you put it that way, I'm happy to say yes, of course. Every day I look at what's happened and ask questions about, is this in line with international humanitarian law? Could the Israelis have done better to avoid civilian casualties? Of course I do that.
In the past 24 hours, Israeli forces have killed 147 Palestinians and injured 243 others in a series of devastating attacks on Gaza, according to the Palestine Health Ministry. Amongst the casualties are children and women. An Israeli airstrike on Rafah city killed at least 15 people and injured numerous others. Another Israeli strike on an apartment building in Tel al-Sultan refugee camp also killed people. Heba al-Badla, an accomplished journalist, was killed in her home in southern Gaza yesterday, along with her 5-year-old daughter, Zuberi. In addition to the civilian toll, 9 Israeli soldiers have died in Gaza since the ground invasion commenced, bringing the total to 187. The conflict has now killed at least 23,357 people in Gaza and 1,139 in Israel since October the 7th. In a recent analysis, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times have been accused of displaying a persistent bias against Palestinians in their reporting on Israel's war in Gaza. The study was conducted by writers Adam Johnson and Uthman Ali and published by The Intercept. It scrutinized the newspaper's coverage between October 7th and November 24th. Focusing on events in Israel and Gaza. The analysis found that these influential newspapers disproportionately highlighted Israeli casualties, employed emotive language to describe Israeli deaths while avoiding such language for Palestinians. They also provided uneven coverage of anti-Semitic incidents versus anti-Muslim racism post-October 7th. Additionally, the study revealed a decline in mentions of Palestinians as the Gaza death toll rose. Notably, during this period, the newspapers used terms like quote-unquote slaughter and quote massacre extensively to describe Hamas-led attacks on Israel. However, they scarcely use these terms for Palestinians killed by the Israeli military. Their coverage of the impact on children and journalists in Gaza was limited, despite the high number of casualties in these groups. The analysis follows prior findings of similar bias in CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC's coverage. The few journalists who have been allowed to enter Gaza as embeds with Israeli forces are required to submit their materials and footage to the Israeli government for review. The Western media's slanted coverage of Israel's devastating war on Gaza has drawn outrage from individual journalists, including some who work at the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times. A group of Jewish American religious leaders staged a protest inside the UN Security Council, calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Under the banner Rabbis for Ceasefire, they criticize U.S. vetoes that have hindered previous ceasefire attempts. The demonstrators urged President Joe Biden to let the UN take urgent action to save lives in Gaza. Displaying banners reading "Biden, the world says ceasefire now," and, quote, "Biden, stop vetoing ceasefire," they sang inside the chamber before being removed by security. Later, they gathered in front of the UN building, emphasizing the international body's unique power and responsibility to achieve a permanent ceasefire. This protest follows 3 months of similar demonstrations across the U.S.
And we're here to say we are American rabbis and we do not support the veto of the United States. And we are here to speak against it and to say you do not veto in our name. The safety of Jews, the safety of Israelis, the safety of Palestinians depends upon safety for everyone. And war does not make anyone safe. And so we are here to ask the United Nations to pursue a permanent ceasefire and to tell President Biden that he is isolating himself. He is becoming a pariah in the world by continuing to support the actions of the State of Israel and to support this war, to send arms and money. He is violating the will of the United States of people.
2 UN experts have strongly criticized Israel for its reported use of lethal drones in extraterritorial operations. The condemnation comes in the wake of alleged killings of Hamas deputy leader Saleh al-Aruri and 6 others in Lebanon. The experts say Israel's actions constitute extrajudicial killing and murder. They also pointed out that Israel has not provided a legal justification for the strike or reported it to the UN Security Council, violating the United Nations Charter. Ben Saul and Morris Tibdal Binz raised additional concerns about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and senior officials openly threatening to target Hamas leaders worldwide. They stressed that under international law, states are prohibited from arbitrarily depriving individuals of their right to life during military or security operations abroad, even when countering terrorism. Saul and Tidbel Binz argue that this did not constitute self-defense, as there was no evidence that the victims posed an imminent threat from Lebanese territory. They also emphasized Lebanon's duty to prevent its territory from being used for terrorist acts against Israeli civilians and called on other states, including Iran and Syria, not to support terrorism in Lebanon or Palestine. They warned that such actions could escalate regional tensions, violate Lebanon's sovereignty, and breach international law. Palestinians Rebury body exhumed from Gaza cemetery. Details come after the break. Stay tuned and we'll be right back. Welcome back. In a distressing scene, grieving Palestinians were seen reburying bodies exhumed from a cemetery in Gaza City. Disturbing footage from Al Tuffa neighborhood cemetery showed bodies wrapped in bags and scattered around damaged graves. Local residents were shocked to find the bodies and alleged that a bulldozer had run over some of them. Men in masks worked to rebury them. Hamas accused the Israeli military of destroying 1,100 graves and taking 150 recently buried bodies. The Israeli army says they are investigating these claims. Doctors Without Borders, or MSF, has strongly condemned an Israeli strike on one of its shelters in Gaza. The attack killed the 5-year-old daughter of a staff member. Over 100 of the International Medical Organization staff and their families were seeking refuge when the child was hit. MSF has notified Israeli forces about the shelter's location, and no evacuation orders were issued before the strike. It is seeking answers from Israeli authorities. MSF has called for an immediate and sustained ceasefire in Gaza and demanded an end to indiscriminate violence against civilians. Donald Trump's legal team is claiming that a president enjoys immunity from prosecution for killing political opponents. The ex-president's lawyer, John Sauer, made the argument in reference to a hypothetical scenario of directing SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political opponent. Sauer stressed a former president's immunity from prosecution for such actions or even the sale of pardons. Trump is seeking to dismiss state-level criminal charges related to election interference in Georgia. He claims his actions were within his official presidential capacity, rendering them immune from prosecution. Trump's claims of immunity have been previously dismissed in a federal election interference case.
And I think we're doing very well. I think it's very unfair when a political opponent, is prosecuted by the DOJ, by Biden's DOJ. So they're losing in every poll. They're losing in almost every demographic. Numbers came out today that are really very mind-boggling if you happen to be Joe Biden. And I think they feel this is the way they're going to try and win. And that's not the way it goes. That'll be bedlam in the country. It's a very bad thing. It's a very bad precedent. As we said, it's the opening of a Pandora's box, and that's a very sad thing that's happened with this whole situation. When they talk about
Sudanese refugees are raising concerns about the insufficient humanitarian aid available to them. Displaced families residing in state schools in eastern Sudan's Port Sudan emphasize the inadequacy of humanitarian aid distribution with concerns about irregularities. Their pleas for international aid organizations to heed their call for help echo amid their struggles for shelter, food, and medical care. The conflict between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, has raged for 9 months. This has led to widespread displacement and dire conditions in the country's eastern regions. The UN reports extensive damage across central and western Sudan, resulting in over 12,000 deaths and 33,000 injuries. Approximately 25 million people, half of the population, urgently requires humanitarian assistance. Over 7 million Sudanese have been displaced within Sudan or have sought refuge in neighboring countries. Pakistan is rejecting the U.S. State Department's designation, describing it as a country of particular concern in terms of its level of religious freedom. The Pakistani Ministry of Foreign Affairs called it biased and out of touch with reality. Pakistan questioned the credibility and transparency of the designation process by the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF. USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan federal government commission established by the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act. Pakistan called for constructive engagement to counter religious intolerance. It also expressed concern over India's exclusion from the list, despite similar concerns raised about its neighbor's state of religious freedom. Yusuf did express disappointment with the State Department's failure to designate Nigeria and India as CPCs. The issue has sparked calls for a congressional hearing. Indian tour operators are canceling flights and bookings to the Maldives amid a diplomatic row over comments made about Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. 3 Maldivian ministers called Modi a, quote, clown, a, quote, terrorist, and, quote, puppet of Israel on social media. It was in response to his visit to India's Lakshadweep Islands, which is seen as an alternative destination to the Maldives. In response to the uproar, the Maldivian government suspended the ministers who made the remarks. Indian tour operators and celebrities are also encouraging travelers to avoid visiting Maldives. The Indian government has also summoned the Maldivian envoy. Maldives is a popular tourist destination in the Indian Ocean, with tourism contributing to almost 1/3 of the country's GDP and most visitors coming from India and Russia. Amid the uproar, Maldives President Mohamed Muizzu has requested China intensify efforts to send more tourists to his country. In response, Chinese state media said Beijing has always treated the Maldives as an equal partner and respects its sovereignty. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell icon for the latest updates. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.